So where we previously left off, we got the entire exhaust system tacked up, and as you can see, it's just kind of hanging on the frame with some safety wire and some tape, just so we don't, so the tacks maybe don't break and it doesn't pull away from the heads or something, and it's so I can push it around my shop safely. Now we're going to work on getting the exhaust mounted, and I wanted to show you a couple different ways that you can mount your exhaust.
It's something you don't want.
Welcome to another edition of Saturday Sportster. So this is a bracket that's available at lowbrowcustoms.com, and you can weld one right to the back of your exhaust, and it has a slider so the bracket will actually be able to move on your exhaust pipe, and it's also slotted with up and down, so after this is tacked up, you'll be able to wiggle this all around to get it to look perfect, the pipe's parallel and everything, because if you've done this before, you'll know that welding this exhaust in a bunch of joints, it'll move ever so slightly, so it'll be nice to be able to have a little bit of play when you bolt this on for the last time. If you're making an exhaust on a bike that, say, the frame's already powder coated, or you're just changing the exhaust on an existing running motorcycle, you could use clamps like I showed you on the Gasbox exhaust, so you won't have to clean off the paint and mess up your powder coat or paint on your frame, and you'll be able to just clamp it right on to your motorcycle. And you can mount it like that. That's not a big deal either. That works just fine. Lots of stock motorcycles exhausts are mounted that way. But since this is just bare steel on the frame and the exhaust pipes, we're gonna mount it with these exhaust sliders, and I'm gonna show you how to do that. We're gonna be able to use just stock tabs that are available at Lowbrow Customs. But on the bottom one, I'm gonna actually have to make a tab because I got a little bit more space on the underside of this, and where the bracket's gonna land, there's just a little bit more gap, so I'm gonna have to make a custom tab just by grabbing a piece of bar, cutting it, and drilling it, and making it look nice to mount on the frame. So let's get started. So I have my tab cut out, and to figure out how long I needed to make this tab, I just hung the bracket. This is a little assembly on the back side, and you could use a clamp or something. I measured up from the top of the tube to the center of the slot. You're gonna want it to be in the center just to give you that kind of adjustment up and down, but also making sure I took out my angle finder, and I want this tube to be parallel to the bottom frame rail. And so I zero out on the frame rail. I'm gonna find that angle first. Then snap this on the tube somewhere where it's not gonna be in your way. And they're already really close. 0.1 is like nothing, so we're gonna use that, and then any adjustment that we need to fine tune this, we're gonna be able to use in the slot. And that actually is jumping to 00 as this tube's kind of bouncing around. So I just measured up from the bottom of the tube, and it doesn't have to be super exact. We're looking at about 1 inch. So I cut out this other piece, and I even put a little chamfer on the side of it, just to make it sit around the tube just a little bit, because the tube's round. So to alleviate some of the gap that I was going to have on one side, I just put a little bit of a chamfer. One more thing that I want to say about this tab, if you've never actually made one of these, after you drill your hole, you could get a nice radius to cut around to make your tab look nice just by using a set of calipers. You could brush on some, just like a Sharpie mark, and scribe along the edge, and then use a straight edge to scribe to the edge of the tab to get a nice angle on it. And that way you're not just going and hacking at it with a grinder to try to get this shape, so you can have a nice uniform looking tab afterwards, and somebody won't be able to just guess and point and look at your bike and know that you made that tab with a grinder. So if you don't have a set of calipers, you should go get a pair. So now that we have all that done, we can bolt this up, and we're gonna actually be able to clamp this onto the tube, the exhaust tube, just using one of these pistol grip clamps to hold this up for welding the bracket into place. Before you put this on, you might want to make sure the orientation of the part with the opening right here is in a way that it's easy for you to take your exhaust on and off your bike. So I would suggest just flipping this around whichever way. So if it's easier for you to actually take it off the slider, or if you just remove the bolt, whatever makes it easiest for you, but don't, or if you're not going to be removing just one or the other, just make sure that they match on your exhaust pipes. But we're gonna put that in the center just to give us the maximum adjustment. And then we also wanna try to keep this tab centered in this slot. And if I can't see any of the slot with the washer on it, it's pretty close to being centered, and I think I'll be okay with that. So we'll get this on here, and we're just gonna clamp it in place, and then maybe stand back and try to line it up. I think that's pretty good right there. I'm okay with 0.1, and then you wanna make sure that I'm not going to be too close to the frame or too far away, so maybe stand back and look from the back side just to make sure that also both pipes can match how far they stick out off the side of the frame. I think that looks pretty good, so I'm going to tack this up and then we're going to work on the top pipe. I started with the front exhaust because this exhaust being mounted in the front didn't have as much wiggle room as the rear exhaust has. It's also just tacked a little bit, and I've got play in some of the joints. And so I wanted to get the front exhaust mounted first and then get the rear exhaust to match. So make sure that you're thinking about stuff like that as you're mounting your exhaust. I need another set of hands. I'm gonna try to attack this. Okay, so now we're just checking our angle. This was, the 0 came off of this thing somehow. All right, we zeroed it out to the frame. There we go. I think I'm okay with 0.1. We're gonna leave that there. Okay, now to work on the top. So now we have the front exhaust totally mounted, just with tacks, but it is tacked on there with brackets and bolts. And so now we're gonna work on the rear. This one is a little easier because I'm using just all brackets that are available at Lowbrow Customs. There's this tab that you can get. I think they come in packs of 4s, and these brackets will actually be sold individually. So in case you only have one pipe, like a header with a muffler, you could just use one, or if you have dual exhausts like this, you'll be able to buy 2 if you need it. I have this made up, and since these are coming together at different angles, like an X, we'll be able to just use a short tab because I can kind of slide it on the exhaust anywhere to fit the frame. Oh, I need to cut that. Oh, that's twisted a little. Okay, I think I'm all right with that. And so I'm gonna tack this on. That looks pretty good. And I mounted it like this before I finished welding it because this is actually going to act as a fixture as I weld the pipes up so that they can't tweak out as much. There'll be something actually holding tension on them to keep them where we want them to stay. Because whenever you weld something, it's always going to have a little bit of a distortion. It's really how you choose to control the distortion is what keeps the pipes straight and keeps them in line, keeps them where we want. So it's good to have some type of fixture when you're doing stuff like this because the exhaust pipes are thin and they do tend to move around a lot if you're just going to weld it on the table. So in my suggestion, I would try to weld as much as you can on the bike. Now that we have them mounted, they're going to stay nice and straight, but they will tend to move a little bit, which is why these have little bit of slots so you can kind of wiggle everything around, and the clamps make it easy too. We're going to leave them just mounted the way they are right now, and I would like to get these cut to length, and then we're probably going to move on to something else. Like I said, I'm going to be cutting these pipes just a little bit shorter, and before I do that, I just want to visualize exactly how much I want to cut off. So since they're high pipes and we're trying to keep them in line and straight across, I'm just going to use this towel and drape this over just kind of so I can visualize how long the pipes are going to be. I'm cutting these just a little bit shorter because I don't want the exhaust pipes to actually go past the tire. Because if I'm backing up or anything like that and I got to store it in my garage, I want to be able to hit the tire to a wall or any obstruction before my exhaust pipes gets all smashed up. So just to keep everything nice, I'm not going to make these go past actually the tire. So I'm going to hold this up, and this is just kind of for reference, and you can get creative with whatever works for you, but this was close by, so I grabbed it, and I'm thinking probably right to the edge of the rim. Maybe stand back and check it out. But I think that looks good, and I kind of want to keep them in line and maybe not cut the rear pipe short. So I'm going to maybe let that, they're going to be maybe the same length vertically from each other. And I'm okay with that. We're not going to actually cut these on an angle. I'm going to cut them straight perpendicular with the length of the tube. Don't get the wrong idea with how the towel's hanging. Okay, so I'm going to remove this exhaust and cut them down. Now that I had this mounted, I realized that I didn't have this tacked all the way around because I wanted to be able to still have a little bit of wiggle room to get the angles and stuff right. But now that I'm actually mounted in the rear, I'm going to tack it and just make sure that we keep it at the angle that we want, because if I would have taken this off, this would have wiggled off and broke my tack. So I'm going to actually tack it all the way around now. And you might want to make sure just when you're going to be taking the pipes on and off, that you're tacked in a spot. Like I would try to get them in 4 places, but just make sure that you don't miss a tack so that when you take it off the bike, you're not going to break your tack and then have to start all over. So I just need to tack it in a couple more spots. This is the little piece that I had that actually slips over the exhaust port that changes. It's like the adapter that goes over the exhaust port to make it 1 3/4 inch. A lot of pipes just have them stamped in, but since we made these, I just had a piece of tube that slid over. A lot of the kits too will actually come with the bump up. Okay, now I can actually take this off the bike. And one of the nice things when you use the right clamps and your exhaust is mounted nice, maybe just with a couple bolts and slots and stuff, I really like how easy the exhaust pipe is able to come on and off the bike just with a couple bolts. So we're gonna get this cut. I'll just hang this one on and swap to the next. Now the front pipe is a hair more complicated to take off because it's got a little bit more going on, but it's the same idea. We're gonna take this off and cut it to our mark. And that front clamp, I think that one's gonna be easier just to take off the front motor bolt. Go. All right. Now we're going to cut it. There we go. So like I said before, I cut them short. Wanted my tire to be able to hit, if you're backing up, hitting into a wall or something. This is just my personal preference. You can make them as long as you want. This is just something that I like to do so I don't have to worry about hitting these on my car or something. Some people like to have them long and low and then they might drag as you're going in and out of parking lots or something. This is just something that I like to do on bikes, but clearly you can make whatever kind of length exhaust that you want. So now that these are totally mounted, they're gonna need to be finished weld, but I would like to jump around to something else and then we'll probably just do a big clip of me welding everything that needs to be welded on this bike. So we're gonna keep moving and we're gonna work on the taillight and license plate next. So we're Back to the rear end of the motorcycle, trying to get these things wrapped up. We got the license plate that still needs to be mounted, and also the tail light. So we've got a couple brackets that we're going to be using. I have this weld-on license plate mount that's designed to weld specifically on the back of your sissy bar. And since we're also going to be mounting the tail light right above it, I got to make sure that I give it enough room going down so that I can put the tail light on it, because I also have bolts coming out of the back of the tail light. I kind of mocked it up first just to see where everything's going to land, and I also like to put some bolts in it because we have to clear the down parts of the sissy bar so we can get all bolts in. And then we're going to be using a box chopper style tail light, and you can see where the bolts mount the tail light to the bracket. We have to mount this low enough so that it clears the inside of the sissy bar, the point coming down. And both of these things are available at Lowbrow Customs. You can buy these mounts, which makes it easier than having to cut this out and find the centers of the holes and then find the center of your wires. And then if you don't slot it, you'll have to actually cut the wires or put some kind of bullets in your wiring to get your taillight off. But this bracket's really nice because it's got this nice big slot, so you can undo the bolts, take the taillight just off, and take your sissy bar off of your bike. Say if you needed if you wanted to change it or work on it any way, you can actually remove your taillight from it without cutting your wiring, which makes these really nice to use. But it's also just speeds things up, and these are also available not just for box chopper lights, but also for Model A's and basically any kind of taillight that you would find on Lowbrow Customs. So we're going to be using these together, and first I'm going to mount the license plate bracket. So now I put some hardware in here just so I know that I'm going to be able to get the hardware in there after it's welded to the sissy bar. And so I'm kind of just eyeballing it from the back, making sure it's center, and I got my squeeze clamps that we've used before, and I'm just going to clamp this right to the sissy bar. And they don't squeeze that tight, so you can still kind of wiggle them around after it's clamped on there. And we're just making sure it's straight and centered and all that good stuff. You can measure off of the bungs, maybe from the fender to the bottom of it on either side, if you're having trouble eyeballing it. And sometimes I even like to line up the bottom edge of the bracket to maybe the cross tube on your frame, because that was held in by a fixture, so you know that part's straight. And you could just kind of measure a couple things and maybe look at it at a few different angles. And this goes for not just your sissy bar and license plate bracket, but pretty much anything. It's good to walk around the bike just to visually see that it's straight from multiple angles. Like I said before, I maybe just measure to the underside. Just a little. How's that? I think that looks good. Before I weld this on, I want to just kind of visually inspect where the bolts landed and make sure that I'm going to be able to get the hardware in and out without it hitting the sissy bar and keeping it from being able to be pulled all the way out. You want to just make sure that you can get bolts onto the bracket, because if you mounted this too low and you didn't put these bolts in here, you could cover up that hole real easy without even thinking about it. So now that I got this clamped on and looking good from the back, everything looks pretty straight as far as I can tell. We're going to tack this on and then get started on fitting up the taillight bracket. So let's get this tacked. And I'm tacking it from the inside, so because I don't want to see the welds after this thing's going to be chromed. I want to hide all the welds on the inside on this. It's not a big deal. You can make it so you can see the welds. I just personally don't want to see them for this one. So now that we got the license plate mounted, we're going to work on the tail light. And like I said before, we're using this bracket. Well, it comes with an additional amount of excess width just so that it can be mounted in lots of different places. Say you didn't want to mount your license plate actually on the sissy bar, you can mount this as low as possible. So we gave you some extra length just so you can mount this basically wherever you want. So the first thing we're going to have to do is figure out how much of the plate we're going to actually use, and we're going to be removing the excess before I weld it to the plate. So I'm going to hold this up and just kind of center it on the sissy bar, and I'm going to be dropping it basically right on top of the license plate bracket that's already on there. So we have a nice spot just to mount it off of and rest it on there as I mark it. And this will be really easy to identify the center because it doesn't have much space to go back and forth. So you'll be able to see how much you need to cut off, and it'll be really easy to center it up between here if you work off of the bolts. So I'm just going to put just a mark on either side, and we're going to just cut that off of either side of this plate. All right, let's cut that off. So I cut the excess off, and I just wanted to match the sissy bar. If you wanted to, you could have matched the radius of this tail light. You could have done any number of things, but I chose to match the angles of the sissy bar coming up. And so we're going to get this tacked on. And I'm using the tail light. You don't really need to for this part of the process, but since I have minimal clearance between the bolts and the sissy bar, it just makes it a little bit easier to make sure that this is centered in the sissy bar, and also that I'm going to be able to get bolts in and out of these spots after it's mounted. So I'm going to be using the tail light, and where's my nifty clamps? I'm going to be working from this side just because of these two bolts that I'm using as a reference point. And this has got the plastic lens on it, so try not to squeeze too hard. You don't want that to crack. You could take it off. I'm just going to be careful. And like I said before, I'm resting it right on top of the license plate. And I was able to weld the license plate on the inside, but since the bolts are on the inside of the sissy bar, I don't really have the room, and I made it so that there's a nice gap between the sissy bar and the plate on the outside that can get smoothed out really easily after it's chrome. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to get this welded on, and like I said before, we're going to weld in just this little void right here, which I think should clean up real nice after it's chromed. There we go. And same for the other side. You got to be careful tacking with these things because the rubber will melt on these clamps. So try to be fast. And there we go. Now we have a tail light. And it'd be a good time to check just to make sure we can get the hardware out. And look at that, that spins out real easy. definitely do this before you weld it on. You could also change the bolts. Maybe some socket head Allens might fit a little easier, especially because you won't have to actually use an open-end wrench like you would with these. You could actually get an Allen that goes inside, and that might be a little bit easier for you. Right now, I wouldn't be able to get actually a ratchet with a socket on these because they're just too close to the side of the sissy bar. So I'll probably be changing those to Allens. But for right now, that works well. So we're going to be running this 4.5-inch cycle standard chopper light, and we've got it mounted on a Gasbox headlight mount specifically designed for 35mm narrow glide front ends, and it mounts right here to your pinch bolts. Super easy to use. This kind of mount has been there have been very many different versions of this over the years. This one's really nice. It's stainless and it's nice and thick. Some of the earlier ones were, say, about 1/8 inch or something, but this is a nice beefy mount for any type of headlight that has a mount on the bottom of it with a pivot. Will bolt right up to this and work great. You could flip it around the other way, say if you wanted the mount coming off, depending on the style of mount that you had for your headlight. I like flipping it backwards because it tucks your headlight in real nice between the tubes. And then make sure you level it out. Clearly we got a little bit of work to do before we're going to be riding this down the road, but it's nice to just get visuals of everything. This is kind of the mock-up stage before we're going to be tearing this bike apart. Going to probably fit as much stuff on it as possible just to make sure that we don't forget anything. And so there you have it. It looks good up there. I like the size. It's cool. It looks just like the larger Bates style, like 5 3/4. It's just like a mini guide light version. Okay, so we're getting towards the end of the fabrication and getting ready to tear this thing apart and get it ready for paint. But before I get to that point, I always like to make a list, kind of go over, and you got to look for the small stuff that usually get forgotten on builds like these. One of which is definitely a brake light switch. These things get overlooked all the time. Lots in part because on a lot of motorcycles, they just bolt in a stock location. Well, when you hardtail your Sportster, you actually get rid of the stock location where they used to mount. They would mount onto your swing arm. When your swing arm's in the trash now, and now you have this bolt-on hardtail, so we have to find a new place to mount this. This is really easy though. You don't really have to, it doesn't have to be super exact because it just pulls a spring that clamps onto your rod, so there's lots of adjustment and kind of free play in this. So you could just like put a tab somewhere, but you want to make it look nice, and also think you got to figure out a place for your wires to come out and get to your tail light in a safe manner. You don't want to like run down the rod or anything, so you have to find a nice way to route it. So for this one, we're using a big twin style switch that's available at Lowbrow, and it's held on by one bolt. And so we've got our brake pivot in the frame in the stock location with the rod attached. We're going to need to make a longer rod for this bike, but we've got it mocked up just for now. And I've got my brake arm on, so I have a pretty good idea of where this is going to land. So now with our switch, I think it'll look good if I just drill and tap this plate that holds on your brake stay, and then we can swivel it so it angles at the same spot, the same angle as the brake rod coming down when that's on there for the final time. But I'm just going to go ahead and I'm just going to mark this. I'm going to drill this later because I don't want to have to worry about drilling into my brake plate and anything like that and have a bunch of stuff in the way. So I'm just going to remember that I'm going to put some threads in that spot. And you can, this is a pretty large diameter hole. It looks like 3/8. I got my calipers right here. Locked. It's a large diameter hole. You could put a 3/8 threads in there. I think the stock one's only 5/16. there's not really too much play in that. So I guess use your best judgment when you're drilling the holes. I'm probably gonna drill this for maybe 3/8 fine, just so it takes up that slack. But it doesn't, there's not really any load on this, so it doesn't need to be that big of a bolt. But it's nice just because there's that large of a hole in it. I'm gonna do this later though, so I just wanted to show you about marking that. And make sure you don't forget stuff like that. And we also don't forget to drill some wire holes and stuff. I'm gonna show you how to do that in the fender, but I'm just gonna mark those right now because we're not gonna do those on the bike. I'm gonna drill holes and weld in some clamps for the wires inside the fender after it's apart. There's no sense in doing that together, but just make a list so you don't forget that kind of stuff, because that could be overlooked if you're excited to get your bike out to paint. Definitely need to look over each part before you send it out, that you didn't forget to weld certain things. I usually inspect each part separately after it's off the bike, and definitely make sure that I weld up all the pieces and maybe grind off parts or just inspect anything one last time before you send it out. That might be it for those things. Right now I might just show you, I'm going to drill some holes in the fender. Another thing we're gonna lay out for some holes, we're gonna put some holes in the fender to route the wires through and figure out where the wires are gonna come out with the bike still together. You wanna do this with everything still on the motorcycle so you have places to clear. So like I said before, you got the wires coming out right here on the sissy bar, and I want the wires to come out of the left side of the sissy bar, the opposing side of the chain. So we're gonna run them in on the left side and probably go right into the corner of the fender. So I want them to just run straight down, and we're gonna be putting a grommet in there so that when the wires twist in, they're not going to be able to hit the steel. The rubber will protect it. And so I'll show you certain grommets that I like to use and where you can buy them, and what size hole you need to drill per the grommet that you're going to be using. So we're coming in through the top. We're gonna run it in the radius, right in the corner of the fender to give it the most clearance to the tire. We're gonna run it all the way down. I wanna come out right next to the bottom of the lower mount for the fender, this lowest fender mounting location. So we can come out of here and go right next to this and under by the battery. So we're gonna mount it right here. Okay, so we have holes marked. We're gonna drill for the fender. We also need to mark where we're gonna cut the fender. I like to keep the fender basically right flush with the bottom of the frame. So we're going to cut the fender just so it goes past the frame, but just to the bottom of it. It doesn't extend further than the frame to the ground. So we're just gonna mark this right at the bottom. And I only really need to put one mark because I'm gonna finish marking the rest of this off the bike, but I know exactly where I wanna cut it at. If you cut it underneath the frame, it'll keep it from getting any more dirt than needs to be on your bike. It gives you a full skirt without giving your motorcycle something to clip on, like a curb or something, and smash your paint. So it doesn't extend past the lowest part of your motorcycle. Some guys like to cut their fenders kind of tall, like right under where their seat goes, but then that gives your tire lots of area to spit stuff all over your bike. So I usually, if I'm putting a fender on a bike, I put them as low as I can get them to keep your bike clean. So this is it. We're pretty much ready to start working on just wrapping this up and getting it ready for paint. So I'm going to start on the finish welding portion of this, like the things I said I definitely wanted to weld up as much as I can on the exhaust. And then I'm gonna be welding various things as I take them apart. Like I get the seat out of the way, I can weld the fender up and stuff like that. I'm gonna start tearing this thing down and welding up whatever I can, finish the rest of the welding on the bench, and I have little things to show you. And the next time you see the bike like this, it'll be in paint and getting ready to go on the road.